This week on the Destination Angler.
Lots of fish up there going, 15 to 20 inches. The occasional fish going, 22 to 24 inches. And then, there's definitely some 8 to 10 pounders. And if you go into the East Lake Resort and have lunch at the Blue Duck Cafe, you're going to see some brown trout hanging on the wall that are, well over 20 pounds.
Welcome to the Destination Angler Podcast, the podcast for anglers who travel. And I'm your host, Steve Haig. We go right to the source, the local guides and experts, to build your knowledge of top fishing locations around North America. It's a big world out there. Now go and fish it.
I'm going away for a while, but I'll be back soon. Whoa, whoa.
Hey listeners, thanks for tuning in. If you're new to the show, be sure to hit that subscribe button to get all the latest episodes of the Destination Angler. And please give us a share, like, or follow on Instagram and Facebook. We have some tremendous shows coming your way in the months of March and April. How about Craig, Montana and the mighty Missouri River with Whitney Gould, the 5-time women's spey casting champion and guide for Headhunters Fly Shop. And after that, we head to central Pennsylvania and the world-famous Spring Creek for a fireside chat with the one and only Joe Humphreys. Joe is a living legend in the fly fishing world and is even featured in the documentary film called Live the Stream. And be sure to backcast to catch our last episode on Penns Creek. Jonas and Matt of the Feathered Hook in Coburn, Pennsylvania, give us a somewhat irreverent look at this masterclass stream. You either love it or you hate it, but it's hard to deny Penns Creek is one of the most challenging streams in the East. And today our destination is East Lake in Central Oregon, and our guest is expert guide and author Jeff Perin, owner of the Fly Fisher's Place in Sisters, Oregon. This part of the world is home to an incredible diversity of water with names like the Deschutes, the McKenzie, the Metolius, Prairie Reservoir, Hosmer Lake, and Paulina Lake, and East Lake, each world-class fisheries in their own right. And we'll get a whirlwind tour of these top destinations and take a deep dive into East Lake, Jeff's favorite, as he dials us into stillwater fishing Oregon style. With over 40 years' experience, Jeff is a wealth of knowledge, having traveled the world in search of trout from Patagonia to Belize to Christmas Island to New Zealand. He's even written for Fly Fisherman Magazine and many other national and local publications, and is a frequent speaker at fly fishing shows and clubs. And he's appeared on 2 episodes of ESPN's Fly Fishing America and is active in many conservation efforts. Hey, it's a good day anytime we can hear from a fishy guy like Jeff, so let's dig in. Well, welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hey, thanks, Steve. Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you. Boy, Central Oregon, this is just a dream come true to be able to talk about this with an expert like yourself. But let me just first ask you, what's the fishing like on the South Island in New Zealand?
Boy, if I could pack up and move away from Central Oregon and move anywhere in the world, it would probably be there. The fishing is spectacular. I've mostly just fished the rivers there, but, driven by so many lakes. And as I've expanded in my own career as a lake fishing guide, I think often of those lakes and wonder, I bet you they're every bit as good as the rivers and not getting any pressure. But some of the rivers that I fished in New Zealand, I had on my first ever trip there. I've been 3 times, and first ever trip there, I had probably one of the greatest big fish fishing days I've ever had in my life on a river, kind of in the central part of the South Island near the town of Fairleigh. So it's special. Wow, no kidding. And you've done some other things while you're there too. You're telling me before the show that you were a sheep herder for about a half a day. It's one of the greatest days of my life. But yeah, the guide told me they couldn't take me fishing in the morning because he had to herd sheep. And I asked him if I could go. And he said, he said reluctantly, yes, why would this Yank want to do this? But he let me go. And remember being at the top of this mountain with him, basically a grass covered mountain with intermittent gorse and rock outcroppings, moving about 400 or 500 sheep from the top of the mountain down into the lower paddock with 2 dogs, a border collie and a New Zealand huntsman, and just watching my friend Kevin, the fishing guide, work his whistle and his hand signals to this border collie. Truly, I remember getting very misty-eyed with emotion, watching kind of man and animal work together to accomplish what would be a really difficult thing without the dog.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. It kind of reminds me of, watching a good bird dog, work up a covey of quail or, get a pheasant to calm down so it'll stop and, get a point on it. Sounds cool.
Yep. Yeah, I'm a big fan of I'm a big fan of dogs. So what dogs can do, whether they're working or just home loving, is pretty neat, man. I think dogs are the greatest creatures ever.
Me too. I'm a dog guy too. All right, so Central Oregon, boy, this area seems to have it all. I mean, you've got big and small rivers, you got stillwater opportunities galore. You can fish for trout, salmon, steelhead. You've got a state record fish that came out of one of those lakes a while ago. Beautiful scenery. I think you got some nice people out there. And did I mention big fish? It seems like the kind of place that, fly fishers really dream of. But, in your mind, what makes this region of the world so special and unique?
Well, I think there's a lot of things about Central Oregon that make it great. Where we are in Sisters, we're really, kind of tucked really close to the mountains. The Three Sisters themselves are the South, Middle, and North Sister. They were named by a Christian missionary, well over 100 years ago, Faith, Hope, and Charity, after his daughters. And they're just three amongst many volcanoes that line us to the west of our town. And they're always in the panoramic vista of any of the drives you do in the area. And because of that, those mountains, a snowstorm can be coming in from the Pacific and hit those mountains, and in just a matter of an hour or two, a strong storm, some of them kind of creep in slowly, but those mountains will accumulate a lot of snow over the course of the winter season. Generally, they start getting snow sometime in late October to mid-November, and it doesn't really stop until sometime around maybe mid-April. That's when the accumulation stops, and they stop taking, kind of water content samples. And from that point on, that water over eons has melted really slowly, some down through the river basins, and a lot of it just through the porous volcanic rock that creates our mountain range here, and goes into a giant water table, which pops up, as springs and spring creeks, and makes some beautiful little ponds and lakes in our region. And so we're very reliant on that snowpack. And
yeah,
this year we're having a decent snow year. It's a little below average yet, but we got a little snow last night, and a little more coming later this week. And it looks wet if you look at the long-term forecast. So hopefully we'll fill up our lakes and reservoirs and have good flows on the rivers.
Yeah. So could you give us just a little tour of maybe some of the top fisheries? What are the top rivers? I mentioned some in my intro. What are the top lakes? And just a little bit about what's kind of different, unique about each of those.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people that know a little bit about Oregon but don't live here, most people have probably heard of the Deschutes River. So you've got the Deschutes, which is a 230-mile long river from its source up in the mountains and those volcanoes that I just talked about. It actually originates in one of the lakes that we fish and flows through two of the reservoirs, and then ends up coming down through the town of Bend, Oregon, which is kind of the hub city of this area, and eventually is a tributary of the Columbia River. And then you've got two major tributaries to the Deschutes. One is the Spring Creek that's closest to my fly shop in Sisters, and that's called the Metolius River. And then you've got the Crooked River, which is a tailwater trout fishery originating out of the Prineville Dam, or Prineville Reservoir, Bowman Dam, and flowing down and also into Lake Billy Chinook. And so the three rivers all go into this giant reservoir called Lake Billy Chinook. And just the Deschutes comes out and flows another 100 miles down to the Columbia River. That section's known for its incredible trout fishing, but also its steelhead run, and for some people, not so much the fly fishing crowd that we associate with mostly, but for some people, it's also a salmon fishery too. Chinook, both spring and fall Chinook. And then there's another spring creek besides the Metolius. It's about an hour south of us, called the Fall River. It's really where I learned how to fly fish. I tell you, I skipped a lot of school to go out and fish the Fall River, and had a few buddies that I went to class with, and it was pretty easy to talk them into getting in my old Datsun pickup truck and heading out to the Fall River for the afternoon. So, and then we've got a tremendous amount of lakes. Prairie Reservoir, East Lake, Paulina Lake, and Hosmer Lake are my favorites, but there are way, way more than that. So you can find anything from hike-in mountain lakes that you could go backpacking in for a multi-day trip, or llama pack into some of them. I got a friend of mine that does llama packing And I mean, there's just a ton of water here. And it's not just here. It extends, we kind of consider our zone to go just a little west of the mountains too. Like the McKenzie River is another famous Oregon River, kind of the birthplace of drift boating in the United States.
Right. The McKenzie drift boat. Sure.
Yep. And so our guides, probably our river guides, I would say there's some of them that probably do 75 or 80% of their trips on the McKenzie by choice. That's their favorite river to fish. And then, we've got tons of water going out into the desert east of us. We've got a little private lake place that we book for that has 5 artesian well-fed ponds with huge trout. There's another spring creek way out there in the desert near there. There are amazing freestone rivers out in an area farther east called the Steens Mountains, which is about a 5-hour drive going towards Idaho from us. But, got easily made leaving in the morning. You can be fishing by the afternoon and stay in the campground for a night or two and fish a couple of days. It's a pretty neat trip, very special.
My head is spinning as you're going through all these different places to fish. Oh, my goodness. Have you fished all these places yourself?
You bet. Yep. Over the years, I've experienced all of them and a lot of years, fished some of them, multiple times during the year.
Right. So you say your guides really love the McKenzie River. What is it about the McKenzie River that you think is so attractive?
Well, really, really good fishing. They've found that kind of employing a little bit of Euro nymphing to the drift boat, drift and just the amount of catch that their clients are getting is just outstanding. Back when I used to fish the McKenzie a lot in years past, and the previous owner of the shop that I bought had actually started a fishing and golf tournament over there called the McKenzie Masters. That was a fundraiser for various charities in that region. Primarily money went to the McKenzie River Guides Association. I used to fish that river a lot during that tournament and other times of the year. I remember, back in the day when I was fishing it mostly, it was almost entirely a dry fly fishery for me, really working the banks with a bushy orange elk-eared caddis or a big parachute Adams, tied with extra hackle to float well. But these great kids that I have guiding for me, they're not kids, they're in their, 30s and 40s or even in their 50s and 60s, but they're just amazing. And they're such good nymph anglers that they're using these Euro nymph techniques, and they're having, in some cases, 100 fish days. So pretty neat.
Wow, that's fun.
Yeah, they're very fun.
That's called bending a rod, I guess.
Yeah.
Tell me about these on Crane Prairie. Tell me about these. I was reading about you guys call them crane bows, these gigantic rainbows that people are catching in there.
Yeah, so the Crane Prairie stock rainbow is the native fish to the area. It's actually a wild red band trout. And of course, the crane bow comes from the fact that Crane Prairie is a reservoir. I believe that the first dam was built there in 1929, and they basically took this big meadow on the upper Deschutes that had, a few little tributary spring creeks and a lot of springs and things like that. And they took that and flooded it out without ever deforesting the area. So Crane Prairie Reservoir itself has a lot of leftover stumps that are still sticking up even since 1929. And the reason that they do so well, and the reason these crane bows do so well, is the water pH. It has a lot of alkalinity. So the trees have kind of fossilized, if you will. And, from the time that I started fishing it in the early 80s to now, yeah, some of those trees have blown down, but there's still definitely a ghost forest out there. And so amongst that, in Crane Prairie, the average depth is probably, I'd guess 9-10 feet. I think the deepest place in the lake is barely over 20 or 25 near the dam. So the depth of the place is very, very shallow, tons of weed beds, lots and lots of springs, and really good hatches of chironomids and calabatus. There's leeches and damsels, water boatmen, daphnia. The lake is just full of food. And so these fish that ultimately, in years past were a fairly small rainbow trout native to the upper Deschutes River and to the Deschutes Basin, finding a 20-incher would have been a pretty darn big fish. Now suddenly have this reservoir to call home. And, for about the last, 100 years now, they've evolved into something a little bit different in this unnatural habitat. And so the cranebow, the crane prairie stock rainbow, has really been a very, very interesting story. And it's very nice to see ODF&W kind of recognizing that more these days as they're using the fish to stock now many of the other lakes in the region, where they used to maybe bring in fish from hatcheries from as far away as Canada to stock some of our lakes. Now they're using local hatcheries and growing, on purpose, crane prairie rainbow stock to put in places like Hosmer Lake and East Lake and things to supplement the fisheries there.
Oh, that's great.
It is great.
And Paulina Lake has got kokanee salmon too, right?
Yeah, and so does East Lake, and so does Wickiup and Crane Prairie.
Okay.
They're all fisheries that have kokanee. And out of the bunch, Wickiup for sure has the most trophy kokanee. So anybody that's truly interested in catching kokanee would be up there kind of in the, later May, June time. The fish are usually pretty close to the surface. And to catch, to really catch them well, I think, it's not really my type of fishing, but I know guys that do it, and they troll, kind of a flasher type of a situation with a little, soft bait, maybe tipped with a small piece of white corn on the end, and that they'll actually troll them pretty close to the surface because the fish aren't going deep at that point yet because of where the food is in the water column.
Okay. Can you get a kokanee on a fly rod at a certain time of year?
Yeah, absolutely. We catch a lot of kokanee on fly rods at East Lake, just kind of through the course of the day-to-day, fishing techniques that I do. When I'm guiding, I try to do at least 3 or 4 or 5 different activities throughout the day just to show people new stuff. But, when we're nymph fishing with a strike indicator or wind drifting with a sinking line of some density, those are usually the times that we get kokanee. That being said, last summer, for the first time in my life, I had a kokanee come up and eat a beetle alongside of a weed bed off the surface. And we certainly, over the last few years, have seen more and more kokanee feeding on Calabatus dry flies during the hatch. So we're catching the occasional kokanee during the hatch. It's funny because, kokanee are supposed to be zooplankton eaters, which they would focus mostly on the extremely large population of Daphnia in the river. But there just can be no doubt that they are not simply zooplankton eaters. They must absolutely be eating other things because we're finding them constantly on the shoals, fishing chironomids under an indicator or wind drifting those same weed bed areas with Calabatus nymphs. So
okay.
Kokanee eat a lot of different things, no doubt about it. Probably my very best kokanee fly is a flashback pheasant tail.
Okay, there you go. That's proof. Jeff, tell me what it is, since you kind of specialize in stillwater fishing, what is it about stillwater fishing that you find just so enjoyable?
I think as a guide, so I'll say this, while I dream about stillwater fishing kind of constantly, because I just love fishing so much, but I definitely stillwater fish on my own. But a lot of my personal days off that I go fishing are usually spent on the Metolius. So I sort of separate a little bit stillwater as an occupation and spring creeks as my hobby. Although I get a lot out of, obviously I still go to the lakes on my days off. I mean, last year I spent about 90 days on the lakes in total, and 65 of those were spent guiding. So, do the math, the other 35 were spent, with my buddies or with my wife, Tina, in the boat. So yeah, I do a lot of lake fishing because I love it, but it's also the time that I spend for work. So for me, the lake fishing is awfully special because there's so much diversity on the lakes here in Central Oregon. If one's not good due to it's a bad year, it's just a bad, fish cycle, water's too warm, water's too weedy this year, there are at least 4 or 5 others that I love to guide that I could go and do. Huge reality for me is as a guide, having people in the boat when, Joe's not going to start walking off downriver and go 3 turns around the river. I'm going to be, where'd Joe go? Having them, inside of an 18-foot boat and being able to be with them and communicate and to me, kind of fish through them. Like I get so much enjoyment of tying on their flies, adding their tippet, picking the tackle, telling them where to cast, telling them, if they're not remembering the mend, to do that. And when that fish comes to the net and I get to hold it and be a part of that, it's as rewarding to me as if I would have reeled it in myself and made the cast myself. So to me, I just get such a charge out of it. Every fish I'm just, really charged up about. I think that's great. And I guess another thing is, for me, up until about 5 years ago, tourism in Central Oregon was still pretty sleepy. But the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a noticeable uptick in people moving to the area, and then, just people moving to the region, Oregon in general, or within a 3-hour drive of us to get over to all of our good fishing. And the rivers here are getting more crowded. Not all the time, but at peak times of the year, they're more and more crowded than they used to be. And to a large extent, for somebody that's fished in Oregon for, nearly 50 years now, that's slightly discouraging to, try to have in my mind's eye that I'm going to go fish a favorite, back eddy for the rusty spinner fall in the evening and find 2 people are there already. And, one of the great things about lakes to me is it doesn't matter if the lake is a little bit crowded or not crowded at all or a lot crowded. There's always places to find the fish. It's not like it's just that riffle or just that run or just that eddy.
Right.
I mean, usually, lakes around the entire edge are all fishable. And so, like for instance, Paulina Lake has, 7.5 miles of shoreline. You'd never have enough boats on the lake on any given day to even think about feeling like you're crowded out. And most of the boats that are on the lake are out in the deep water kokanee fishing with jigs. So the fact is that, us fly fishermen have miles and miles and miles of really good shoreline fishing that we're not feeling pressured. And I love that. I don't mind if I am on the river hiking a little bit more to get off the beaten path and find some more, some quieter water that's less pressured. But on the lakes, I sort of always feel like that. And I guess on these lakes here in Central Oregon, they're also so undeniably beautiful with mountain views and forests surrounding them and the water itself, clear in some cases, blue in other cases, greenish tint in some of them, but they're all different, but they're all really beautiful. And so that attracts me obviously to these lakes too. Plus the fishing, and fishing is outstanding.
Good fishing.
Yeah.
Well, let's shift gears and talk about East Lake. So with all these amazing fisheries around here, you spend a lot of time on this lake, and I'm kind of curious, why is that? And why do you find the lake just such an amazing spot?
Yep. Well, I think it's a couple of reasons. We have a long-time family history there. My grandparents started fishing East Lake back in the 50s and originally brought me there in the early 70s. And so I've been fishing it for that long.
Wow.
So it feels like home. My grandma and grandpa's ashes are up on the mountain that overlooks East Lake called Paulina Peak. And I think about them every day because they were the folks that left me the money to be able to buy my business and do what I do. So they introduced me to fishing, and unbeknownst to them, really set me up for a lifetime of pretty great stuff. But East Lake itself is this 1,000-acre, volcanic caldera lake that has a huge shoreline around the majority of the circumference of the lake, meaning water that generates enough sunlight penetration to create, weed growth and photosynthesis, and that brings in the bugs, and of course that brings in the trout. And if you look at East Lake and look at how much shallow water there is, even though the lake is nearly 180 feet deep at its deepest point, you look at just how much shallow water it is, and it's really a fly fisherman's paradise. And so one of the things that attracts me to it as a guide is, I think I mentioned this earlier, I don't like to do the same thing all day long. I don't want to stare at an indicator all day long or strip, anchor up and strip sinking lines all day long. I don't mind doing those as part of my day, but I want to be able to find a dry fly hatch or at least a dry fly opportunity. If the hatch isn't going, is there a terrestrial fishing opportunity? And at East Lake, there definitely is. And there's also definitely great hatches, starting in late May and going in June and July, and then a second brood of calabatus in August and early September. Chronomid hatches that can be really, really strong in the summertime. So there's just a lot of different things. So on any given day, I may do some wind drifting across the shoal with using a sea anchor or a drogue.
Okay.
Deployed off the side of my boat to keep the boat perpendicular to the wind and also to slow down the drift. And we may be kind of trolling the flies upwind of the boat and just letting the wind move the flies, or we may be casting those flies downwind with some retrieves. That's called lock style or competition lake fishing. And then from there, we may find an area that on the fish finder, we're seeing a lot of fish. It's probably going to be in that 16 to 18 foot range. If you're fishing there in the summer, you may stop, pull the drogue in, double anchor the boat, switch rods with people and have them fishing strike indicator with a very long, 20 foot leader and 2 or 3 chironomids or a chironomid and a calabatus nymph on the system. And then from there, we might move on, on a windy, especially on a windy afternoon, but really any afternoon as the sun has been out for a while and kind of warmed up the rocks and the trees around the lake, start to go throw beetles along the shoreline. And so if I started out with a hatch in the morning and did, all those different things, I may have shown the customer or fished myself 5 different ways in a single day of fishing. And that, to me, that's cool,
Yeah, you get their money's worth.
Yeah, your mind is occupied in different things. You're constantly finding fish in different ways, which is fun. And for my clients, they're learning lots and lots and lots about different ways to catch fish in lakes. And they're kind of blown away by how much I do move around. And the other thing that I think a lot of people are blown away with is how often I change flies. So, I mean, not if the fly's working, but, if the fly's not working, I don't give it a lot of time. I kind of get a gut feeling. I just know that it, sometimes it's not about the fly, but a lot of times it is about the fly. And if I keep changing, I'm going to find that combo that's going to start working for them.
You're going to find some.
Yeah.
Like how long would you give a fly that isn't working for you?
Yeah. It depends on how we're fishing it. But if we're fishing static under an indicator and it's been, sitting there dangling under the indicator for 5 minutes without a single, sniff to the fly, that fly's coming off. If we're, casting a dry fly to fish that are rising and there's so many fish rising around the fly and it's not got anything, to even come and look at it or got a refusal, that's even more of a like snap your finger moment. Okay, I gotta get this fly off and change it to something else. Usually that's less than 5 minutes too. And so many people, I think, are really, really stuck to their fly. I got to fish this fly for a long time and see if it works. But I think it should be just the opposite. You should be cutting that fly off and changing and find the combination that works. And just because it worked today doesn't mean it's going to work tomorrow. It's a new game tomorrow.
I was going to ask you that. Does it change, from day to day?
Sometimes. I mean, usually there are good trends, but let's just take, for instance, the calabatus hatch. Some days, they may be really, really keyed into, say, an emerger that's tied on a scud type hook where half of the, nymphal shuck type of the part of the body is down underneath the surface film, and then it has a wing that's above the surface film, casting a little shadow, looking like the adult is wriggling out of that nymphal shuck at the surface.
Sure.
And other days they may be like, no, I want it tied on a straight shank dry fly hook, like a sparkle dun, with a Zeeland tail and a, straight dry fly body and a Comparadun style wing. And other days they might want, we've got this emerger. I call it the collaboration calabatus, and I've taught it at our local fly club a couple of times for classes because I don't really know the name of it. It ended up in my hands from a good friend and fishing companion in the parking lot at East Lake one day. And it was just this fly that he had a friend give him, or he made it up, or they collaborated on it. And I got it and remember guiding this guy from Denver the next day who just railed with that fly. And the day before, when I didn't have the fly, we had a tough day, so eventually I started tying them. And it's a funny emerger because it's got a Zeeland trailing shuck. And then we use Ozark turkey tail feathers for the body. And then thorax is grizzly hackle tied over a UV calabatus dubbing, and it has a split poly wing on it. But that hackle holds it up like the mayfly is just about ready to take off. Like it's starting to flutter, but it's still attached to the trailing shuck, and it's a really good profile from time to time for those fish.
Yeah.
But not every day, right? I mean, that's
Sure.
the point of this, is that you got to have, you can't just have one emerger in your box. I don't care whether you're lake fishing or one dry fly, whether you're lake fishing or stream fishing. You got to know what the hatches are and then be able to cover it from kind of top to bottom.
Yeah. This is exactly why people should hire guides for sure when you first get to an area, because you're just not going to know this stuff going out on your own.
Yeah, hiring a guide is worth it, but at least go talk to the local fly shop.
Yeah. Assume your boat is motorized?
Yeah, definitely the boat's motorized.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a Minn Kota trolling motor with 80-pound thrust at the bow, and then a 60-horse Honda motor at the stern.
So you can get around.
Yeah, when I'm fishing, mostly the electric motor is what's deployed most of the time, and I do I have front and rear anchors, so the boat doesn't spin and twist in the wind. We're really secured to the bottom with 30-pound anchors on both sides of it. And then of course we use that sea anchor a lot too for slowing down the boat when we do want to keep moving.
Okay. Well, orient us a little bit here. Where is East Lake compared to you? You're in Sisters, which is just north of Bend, correct? Where is East Lake?
Yep. So yeah, Bend is actually just a little east of us. We're actually more northwest, but more west than north, I guess, from Bend here in Sisters. So we actually, from Sisters, we drive into Bend, which is about a 25-minute drive. It passes out of the Ponderosa Forest once you leave Sisters and starts getting more deserty, lots of juniper and mixed pine forest. And then as you go through Bend, which is a big city, it's about 100,000 people now. You fortunately can take a little freeway bypass through Bend when you're pulling 23 or 24 feet of boat motor and trailer through downtown Bend. It's not that nice, so that freeway's really made it easy. And then it's just a quick trip south back into the pine forest and up into the Newberry Crater outside of Sun River, Oregon, between Sun River and La Pine.
Okay. Well, just backtracking for a minute here, for people that are new to lake fishing, we were talking about shoals. So define for us, what is a shoal?
Yeah. So a shoal is a shallow enough area in the lake to sunlight penetration occur. And so generally speaking, that would encourage plant growth through photosynthesis. And so a shoal is any area. So a really, really clear water lake could technically have a shoal that's a lot deeper than a lake that had not as clear of water. But that shoal area, I mean, just going out on a limb here and saying something very general, I don't like to make generalizations, but I'd say the shoal is generally speaking that area of water between about 5 and 30 feet deep in most trout lakes. We could argue that area between 18 to 30 feet is really fishing deep water for fly fishing techniques.
Yeah.
But technically it's still the deep part of the shoal, in my opinion. And, under 5 feet from the shoreline out to that, kind of under 5 feet, I just call that the shoreline area, the real shallow shoreline area in most cases. So that's another terrific zone to fish, but the shoal is probably the area that's going to hold the most fish throughout the course of the majority of the season.
Sure. So how good can the fishing be?
Really good. Really good. I mean, you could sit there on a day on the shoal during chironomid emergence and have the boat anchored up, have 2 or 3 people, with rods over the side of the boat and be netting a fish every couple of minutes.
Oh my gosh.
You could also do motor out, deploy the drogue, drift in with the breeze and be fishing a calabatus nymph and maybe a leech or something like that in combination, or damselfly nymph and calabatus nymph in combination, and have your client catch, a fish to 2 or 3 fish on every drift, keeping in mind that each drift in from start to finish is probably 400 to 500 yards in length, which can take, depending on how much the wind is blowing and how good of a sea anchor or a drogue that you have deployed, how big it is to slow down the boat, that can take a half an hour.
Right. And just to give people an idea of this, what kinds of size of fish can you expect in a day, would you say?
Yeah. So, definitely at East Lake, the fish are quite nice. I mean, a 12 incher is kind of a smallish fish. Lots of fish up there going, 15 to 20 inches. The occasional fish going, 22 to 24 inches. And then, there's definitely some 8 to 10 pounders. And if you go into the East Lake Resort and have lunch at the Blue Duck Cafe, you're going to see some brown trout hanging on the wall that are, well over 20 pounds. So that came out of that lake. So it's, there's big fish in there. But when I'm guiding, I'm not looking for I'm not a trophy hunter guide. I'm an experience guide, and I take kind of the same feeling into my own fishing. Like I want to do well. I want to catch fish in the ways that I would catch fish, but I want to get more numbers on the board. I don't want to catch a bunch of small fish. I don't want to catch teeny fish, but I just want to catch, good quality fish and kind of keep the day interesting and keep the numbers going. And if there's a lull in the day, that just means it's a different move on my part. It's, it's a game, right? No, where do I move the pond from here? So that's the fun of it.
Yeah, it's kind of called fishing. You're going to have lulls, I think, most days.
Yep, every day, probably.
Well, I think it's great to define success, other than, numbers and size. It's the experience that you're trying to give them. And it seems like that's a common thread throughout the podcast as I'm talking to different guides. They're, it's really about the experience. And I think most anglers would agree with that too.
Yeah. And, I'm competitive. I want to catch, I want to catch or have my people catch more fish than they've ever caught, or more fish than anybody else in the lake. I don't mind that too, but I know that really in my heart that's not why they hired me, but that's still kind of my, competitive nature, wanting to come out for them, or for me, but especially for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's ego, I admit it. It's ego, it's yeah, we caught 40 fish today. We netted 40 fish today. That's a egotistical statement. It's terrible, but it's kind of also how fishing goes sometimes, right?
No, it's something to write home about if you can do that. Well, let's talk about your story. So you're a shop owner and an outfitter in Sisters, Oregon. Tell us how that all came about.
Well, I can tell you from as long as I can remember wanting to be a fly fisherman. Even before I was a fly fisherman, we were still living in Portland. I grew up in Portland until the 6th grade. I remember going to the Multnomah County Library in the summertime with my mom and my sisters, and I would go to the fishing section and check out the fly fishing books and go home and read them and look at the pictures, and then getting a subscription to Field and Stream and seeing, fly fishing stories in there and just thinking, this is the coolest thing ever. And remember, going to church on Sundays with the family and, sitting there as the sermon's going on, and I'd sit and write, draw pictures of fly fishing scenes on, notepads with my coloring pencils that I would bring in church, real serious on my part for religion. And that kind of keeps going to now into my 50s. So when we moved to Bend, we came over and looked for a house in March of 1980. And I remember driving by the fly shop, and I said, Dad, can we stop? And we stopped, and my sisters and mom stayed in the car, and my dad and I walked in. People were really nice and welcoming. And I looked around. It's the first fly fishing store I'd ever been in my life. And I thought, this is the coolest thing ever. It turned out the house we bought was a bike ride distance away from that fly shop. So I spent a lot of time there that first summer, and then got into fly tying classes that fall, and ended up taking advanced fly tying classes and a rod building class and things through junior high and high school. And then in my junior year of high school, they hired me. And then I was going to the community college in Bend and taking classes that were interesting, but not really sure where I was going to go with college. And the owner of the Fly Fishers place called me and invited me to the Trout Unlimited banquet. And he was the chairperson that year. And it was, in Central Oregon, the Trout Unlimited banquet's kind of a big event. It's fancy.
That's the biggie.
Yeah, you actually put a nice shirt on for it. Yeah. So I sat at his table, and afterwards he says to me, we're thinking about a new manager, and we're very interested in you. Would like to have you come out and talk to us. And so I did, and he hired me, and I managed the store for him for about 9 months. And to make a long story short, some things came up for him, and I had an opportunity to buy it. I had a little inheritance money. I borrowed a little bit more from my folks and a good friend of mine who was a retired Army colonel, and rounded up the funds, and away I went.
How old were you at this point in time?
That was in 1991 when I was 22 years old.
22. Wow, no kidding. It sounds like this guy was kind of eyeballing you for his succession plan here. And then we'll let him run the shop for a little bit. And if it works out, I'll try to sell him the store.
Yeah. I think to a certain extent, that's true. He really wanted to find somebody to kind of carry on the legacy of, good quality products and customer service and a clean, inviting atmosphere, and I think he trusted me that, what he started would be finished, with love and carrying to all those ideals. And indeed, that's how I've kind of taken on the business.
No, that's great. I was going to ask you, what is it about running the fly shop that you really enjoy the most?
Well, I mean, so many cool friends that come into the fly shop that I would have never known if I, would have worked for, UPS or something. I mean, just the people. And then the gear, I love fly rods and really nice reels and, lines that cast easily, that kind of stuff has always turned my crank. I'm kind of a gear guy to a certain extent, maybe a little less now than I used to be, it's kind of calmed down some, but I like really nice stuff now. And so those are the things that draw me in, to doing it year after year. It's just comfortable. The shop that we have is really comfortable. It's a small shop. It's about 1,500 square feet. And a lot of people come in and tell me it's their favorite fly shop. And a lot of people also say it has the best fly selection they've ever seen. I do all the fly buying. It's kind of a bit of a specialty of mine because I am such a match the hatch geek, and Euro nymph geek. And so I like sitting down with all the reps and perusing their catalogs and their samples and just kind of getting a gut feeling like, yep, this is going to be killer next year. We're going to take,
right.
We're going to take 50 dozen of those because I know that's going to be a great fly. So yeah, that's a real favorite part of my every fall when we have to do the preseason orders. It's time consuming and I don't always have time for it, but it's a favorite part of my season for sure.
Yeah. You were telling me before the show that you had quite a day many years ago when you were getting your permits to go fish the rivers in the Deschutes National Forest. I was wondering if you could kind of tell us that story. You know what I'm talking about?
I do. Yeah, that's a fun story, and it was an expensive day. So I bought the permit to guide the Deschutes National Forest. I basically bought this guy named Craig his Blue Sky, because he can't sell his permit. He had to transfer the permit to me through the Deschutes National Forest. So I bought his Blue Sky, and I remember Craig very fondly. He was a retired school bus driver. Well, he was actually an active school bus driver when he was still guiding, and he'd drive a school bus during the school year and then come over and guide in the summertime and bring his trailer over and his wife, and they would camp and guide, and he had quite a nice little easygoing business and extra money in the summer when he wasn't driving the bus. And I got to meet him, and I won't go into the full detail, but to make a long story short, he liked me, and when I offered to buy his business, we came up with price and came up with a plan and a date to get him his money, and that happened to be over in Portland. I left my sister's house, drove up Barnes Road, which is in the west side of Portland, kind of a steep little mountain in the middle of Portland, and met him at a Starbucks and gave him a very large cashier's check. And then I drove up and over Burnside Road over the mountain there, going down into downtown Portland, went to a jewelry store where at the time my girlfriend and I had looked at a ring that she liked and went in and bought an engagement ring.
Oh, man. And
then drove across town, got out of the downtown core and drove down to a marina on the Columbia River in Portland and bought a motor, a nice Yamaha motor for my boat that I was having built at the time to start my new guide business. This was about 11 years ago now, and it was a great day. I remember kind of being a little little shell shocked financially at the end of the day, but everything was a super good investment.
Yeah.
So that was in, I think it was in late March or April that happened. And I couldn't use the boat that was being built in that new motor that I just discussed, but I did take my drift boat out onto one of the lakes with my electric motor and hid the ring in a box full of flies, box full of chironomids, as a matter of fact. And the hatch started to happen, and asked Tina to open the box and pop the question out there in the lake, and the answer was yes. And we caught some fish and drank some champagne and celebrated. So far it's almost 11 years now. So we're
good for you.
Yeah, we're next November we'll be married for 10 years, and it's been a great relationship. I took her to Chile when we were dating to go fish in Patagonia, and she essentially learned how to fly fish
in Patagonia.
Yeah. So she got spoiled right off the bat.
Yeah, I'll say that's a story only a guide or an outfitter could tell. Putting the wedding ring in a box of chironomid flies. That's great. I love that.
Oh, for sure. Yep.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about stillwater fishing for a little bit. So, if you're an angler out there and you're used to fishing rivers, and let's say this person is coming with you on a trip, so what's the conversation you're having with that angler to get them, dialed into the differences of lake fishing versus river fishing?
Yeah. So, one of the things, I'm not sure that this is a conversation that often, just starts automatically with clients, but it happens a lot when I'm giving presentations to fly clubs and talking to people from behind the counter in the fly shop that may be, going to the water, without me or without a guide, or without any sort of, particular guidance ahead of time. Because if you're coming from a river and you know how to read a river, and, at different times of the year or even different times of the day, the fish are going to be in the riffle, the run, or the pool, or along the edges, or in a back eddy. It's pretty easy to read moving water to a certain extent. I mean, we can learn that very, very quickly as anglers,
Sure.
Walking upstream or walking around in rivers or wading around in rivers or doing all of the above. But going to a big open body of lake, and the bigger the lake, I think the more intimidating it becomes to a lot of people. You look at Crane Prairie at 4,000 acres, or East Lake at 1,000 acres, and Paulina at 1,500 acres, with over 7 miles of shoreline on Paulina itself. You're like, where do I even start? But I think it's really easy to kind of break it down into, all right, most of the fish are probably going to be caught in 15 feet or less. So we got to know water temperature, got to know seasonality, got to know hatches. But for the most part, a lot of those fish are going to be from about, a foot deep out to about 15 feet deep. And if you just started focusing on that alone with a couple of different techniques, like dry fly fishing and fishing a strike indicator with a nymph, you would probably be already a pretty successful lake fisherman from what I could say and tell. Okay. So that kind of simplifies it to a large extent. And then beyond that, you could get out into, more vast zones of shallow to moderately deep water, and start fishing different densities of sinking lines, whether that be like a midge tip or a slow sinking hover, an intermediate or a type 3, or even a really fast sinking line like a type 7. Those are all going to get to the depths where you're going to find the fish.
Yeah. So when you're fishing, Jeff, with clients, do you have, different rod rigs kind of ready to go that you can just grab on a moment's notice?
I do. Yeah. I've got usually 8 to 10 rods in the boat, 8 of which are always set up, ready to go in pairs. So if we're dry fly fishing, they're in the Calabasas hatch, I can grab a couple of 9-foot 5-weight rods with a 12-foot 5X or 6X leader on there, and have them both fishing dry flies at the same time. If that suddenly changes, the hatch is over and we need to fish a nymph, I've got shallow water nymphing rig set up, and I've got deep water nymphing rig set up if we've got to go out into that 15 to 20 foot zone. And then I've always got a sinking line set up, sometimes multiple sinking line rods set up at the same time, maybe one with an intermediate and one with a type 3 certain times of the year. Some days the fish are a little closer to the surface, some days they're a little deeper. So when we are doing those strips or drifts, I'll find the fish and then we'll stick to those lines. But it's really nice to have them all set up so you're not wasting time during the day. It takes just building a deep water chironomid rig takes a good 10 minutes. So I don't want to waste anybody's time. I need that set up. And from time to time, some will get really tangled in a bad cast and it will have to get totally rebuilt. But that's a whole different, deal. And that's understandable. But for efficiency, I said this when I made a presentation to our local fly club last week on Zoom. I was like, you for sure got to have a dry fly rod, an indicator rod, and a sinking line rod set up with you. And whether you're out in a float tube or a pontoon boat or a bigger boat like what I'm using, if you're really going to lake fish effectively and efficiently, for sure, 2 or 3 rods is really kind of an essential part of your day.
You got to have it. I got you.
And I'm a big fan of 10-foot rods, 10-foot 5 weights, and 10-foot 6 weights for lake fishing, and have been using 9-foot 5 weights for dry fly fishing. But this season, I'm switching over to 2 10-foot 4 weights for that, hoping that the little softer tip will protect some of the 6X tippet takes that we get on the calm days when the hatch is on.
6X?
Mm-hmm.
No kidding. So you got to go down to 6X sometimes. Okay.
The lake can get pretty glassy, and 5X just won't cut it.
No kidding. Okay. Does that have anything to do with fishing pressure, or is it really just smart fish that can see line because it's just sitting there?
Well, I think fishing pressure makes smart fish, but yeah, I would guess it's a little of both. But just imagine a lake that's glassy, glassy clear and not a ripple on it. The thinner it is, the easier you're going to fool those fish, especially with a small fly. A size 16 calibatus is, tied to 5X, looks like a rope.
Yeah, right. Yeah, how long leaders are you fishing in? And I'm sure that varies a little bit by what you're doing.
Usually for customers, we'll start with a base of 9-foot 5X leader and either add more 5X or 6X tippet. So general leader length is between 10 and 12 feet usually. And, sometimes when I'm fishing on my own, it's more like, 14 to 18 feet, just depending on what we're doing. I mean, you don't necessarily need that much leader, but sometimes you do.
Okay. And multiple flies? Is that okay out in Oregon?
Yeah, definitely okay. I don't do multiple dry flies too often. I do it sometimes.
Sure.
I did start using a technique that I learned fishing in Tasmania on the lakes there a few years ago with a really great guide named Tom Jarman in Tassie. And he showed us this method called the washing line. So it has a dry fly on the end, which is called the point. And then coming back towards the fly line, the leader would be pretty long and would have at least 1, if not 2, little dangling emergers or nymphs. And so the dry fly itself kind of acts as a strike indicator if the fish take those, but it also helps hold those flies up a little closer to the surface. So you're not going to use a real heavy, tungsten bead-headed fly on that dangling fly in between the fly line and the point fly. But it's a pretty cool method. And I actually had one of my customers catch the biggest fish I've ever seen at Hosmer Lake using that method last summer.
Oh, nice. Hey, we'll put a link on the Destination Angler website to a great little video on the washing line technique, so you guys can check that out. Tell me about the food sources in East Lake or in your lakes in general. Now, what are the food sources and kind of walk us through that? Yeah.
So I would say the top 3, are chironomids and calibatus mayflies and leeches. And then moving on from that, and arguably at certain times of the season, terrestrials, and especially the way that I like to fish the edges of the lake, beetles and ants, in some cases,
okay,
grasshoppers and even bees, like spent yellow jackets, damselflies, dragonflies, water boatmen, scuds, and then little kind of strange things, things that a lot of people might forget about, but like Daphnia, which are a little single cell microorganism that are in the family of zooplankton. And I do, at least a fish a day. I guess not always, but often, at least a day, every day, I'll put a throat pump sample into a cup just to see what the fish are eating. And it's, 100% almost that that they're going to have a fair number of Daphnia mixed in with the other things that they're eating. Some days it's, totally chironomids because it's just like a major hatch. Other days it might be totally calabatus because it might be a major hatch. But if the fish are grazing a bit, I guarantee you that they're going to have a couple of chironomids and a whole bunch of Daphnia, maybe a scud and a few water boatmen all mixed in. And so, those Daphnia can be pretty important and kind of forgotten.
And those are cluster flies you're using to fish for those?
Yeah, typically they're cluster flies for sure. Flies like blobs and fabs that kind of came out of that UK, fishing scene. And yeah, doing those underneath a strike indicator or on a really slow retrieve on a sinking line, definitely catch fish. Also wind drifting them. I've had some really good luck wind drifting the blobs and stuff for kokanee. They're the ones that particularly like to eat those clusters when you're wind drifting.
Huh. Okay. And for people that maybe don't fish lakes a whole lot, can you tell us, like, what is a calabatus? What is a chironomid? And, like, how do you fish those?
Yeah, for sure. So starting with calabatus is a mayfly. So probably everybody is familiar with blue-wing olives. Out here in the West, they're the species of Baetis. And so calabatus is a very close relative to Baetis. They're generally found entirely in stillwater, although some very slow-moving rivers like areas of Silver Creek in Idaho, which is a world-famous fishery, have some calabatus. But for the most part, calabatus here in Central Oregon are only going to be found on our stillwaters, on the lakes and reservoirs. And so they have an incomplete metamorphosis. They start as a nymph after, the female lays her eggs. Start as a nymph. They have 2 broods a year on most of our lakes here, meaning that the spring hatch, when the spinner lays her eggs, those eggs will sink to the bottom. Actually, I'll tell you something that's very interesting about calabatus. The female actually goes to the shoreline and incubates the eggs on the tip of her abdomen for about 5 days. And when she goes to do the spinner fall and lay the eggs instantly hatch into nymphs at that time. It's the only mayfly species that's known to do that. Most mayflies, when they lay their eggs, the eggs sink to the bottom and incubate down there for a few days and hatch into tiny little nymphs, which go through several instars to grow. The calabatus are already nymphs once she comes down to the water, and so that creates a process where those nymphs that are hatched in the early summer have enough time through the midsummer and into early fall to make a second hatch for the year. It's called the second brood. And so the nymph swims to the surface and does a process called emergence. It's not pupation. It doesn't have a pupa stage. It's just simply a mayfly emerger at the surface. The dun, which is called the subimagio, hatches out of that nymph shuck, flies away, goes up into the trees, molts one more time into a spinner. And that spinner now has a little bit longer tail and totally clear wings. The males and the females will then go high up above the lake or above the trees and do a little mating dance. And they find each other through their dances and through their coloration. And I'm told through some UV capabilities. And they get together, and then those females come back to the lakeside and hang out in the streamside grasses and brush and let those eggs incubate and mature. And then 4 or 5 days later, come back to the lake and lay them and start the process all over again. So it's a really, really great, and we'll get days where the calabatus hatch is really intense. It'll last for hours and hours, and it's a feeding frenzy on the water. And you can start in the morning before the hatch with the nymph, and early on in the hatch, still keep fishing the nymph, and then move to the emerger, and then to the dun. And then at some point during the day, oftentimes it's in the earlier morning before the hatch even starts, there could be a spinner fall. And sometimes it can be very frustrating. The spinner fall will happen exactly when the hatch is happening, and that can lead to some pretty frustrating fishing experiences because
confuse things.
It's difficult to figure out which fly to fish. And then you asked about chironomid life cycle too. So chironomids are midges are in the family of chironomids, and really it's a synonymous insect. Midges are typically thought of as those small, tiny little flies that you see on the rivers or ponds or lakes that are small in the kind of 18 to 26 hook size, or maybe even smaller than that. Not too many of our people are going to fish flies much smaller than a 22 or 24, but some do. And chironomids are the same darn thing, but they can be as big as a size 8, locally known as buzzers in some of the lakes. But I would say the typical size for them in our lakes, like at East and Crane Prairie, generally 14 and 16 hooks are going to match most of what you're going to be fishing with. So those are an important hatch. The pupa is by far the most important stage to imitate, and we usually fish those under a strike indicator and put a gang of flies on the leader, at least 2, sometimes 3, and maybe vary the color of the fly as it gets closer to the surface. But the larval stage, which is sometimes known as a bloodworm because some of them can be bright red, full of hemoglobin, will come out of their little mud casings at the bottom of the lake, their homes, if you will, and they'll actually hover. They're not ready to pupate yet, but they'll actually hover, 6 or 8 or 10 inches above the bottom of the lake. I guess, feeding, I don't know, catching some oxygen, more than likely, but they can do that for hours, if not a day or so, before going down back into their little mud hut, which eventually they'll seal off and pupate in there. And then the pupa comes out, and the pupas, this is really fascinating. Of course, I've never seen this because I don't own scuba gear, but I've, certainly read about it. But the pupas will come out, and there can be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, kind of hovering in sort of a suspension mode just above the bottom of the lake. And they may stay there for days before they're ready to fully gas up their little air sac and start their ascent towards the surface.
Okay.
So it can be a real feeding frenzy for the fish. So if you know that there's a blackish silver, size 16 pupa that's coming up frequently in your throat pump sample, you can match that fly pretty easily and get that fly pretty close to the bottom. And, this is a game of inches. You could be, you could have your fly set at 12 inches above the bottom, but the fish are feeding maybe 15 inches above the bottom and not be catching that many fish. So adjusting the indicator on a slow day can pay big dividends.
Okay. Hey, we'll put a bunch of pictures of Jeff's favorite flies in his fly box out on the Destination Angler website. Yeah, and how do you fish that pupa? I mean, are you just letting it sit there? Or are you doing any kind of movement or retrieve on that?
Yeah, more often than not, the fishing's so good with that system when it's on that no, I don't really move it too much. You just cast it between 20 and 40 feet from the downwind side of the boat and just kind of let that indicator sort of bob around in the wind chop if there is some on the water and watch the indicator for any slight movement. Usually the browns are the ones that really pull the indicator under. Some days the rainbows do too, and the kokanees are hitting it with a really, really slight movement of the indicator. And you just have to be ready with a quick hook set. And other days I've had slow days where just the static dangle isn't all that good. And, adding a very, very slow hand twist retrieve, which is the only real retrieve that you're going to be able to do that's completely smooth. So if you looked at 2 different strips, so like from, putting the line underneath your grip hand and your index or middle finger, and then, stripping 4 to 6 inches with your non-casting hand, and moving that fly, guess what the indicator is doing every strip? It's leaving a little bit of a wake because it's not a smooth strip.
Yeah, not good, huh?
So that's not a good because it's kind of bouncing that indicator a little bit. It's leaving a wake. It's maybe spooking the fish. And down below, those nymphs that are dangling are getting too much upward movement on every strip and then falling back down. You probably one of the reasons it's not working so well is you're missing a lot of the takes. The fish, take the fly in and spit it out before the indicator ever moves because they're taking it on the drop, not when it's tight.
Yeah.
So if you move that technique to a hand twist retrieve, which is entirely smooth and has no jerky motion, the flies stay at the same depth. The indicator isn't waking at all. And so some days when it's slow, man, I'll do that with the chironomid or I'll put a combination of maybe a balance leech and a chronomid, or a chronomid and a calibatus nymph on, and definitely move, because two of the three flies, or one of the two flies that's on there is really meant to be moved. So, and it's amazing how often the fly that you would think, oh, isn't supposed to be moved, but they're taking it when it is. It works.
Yeah. No, that's great. A really good overview of those primary food sources and how to fish for them. Let me ask you, do you have maybe a favorite memory, or a memorable fish or something, some story you could tell us about, a day that you've had on the lake?
I'll tell you two stories from just this last fall that I think are kind of fun. Something that I've never ever seen before. I had a client in the boat that was stuck. He had snagged one of the flies up onto the shallow portion of the ledge that we were fishing, and his other fly was not hung up. And I was just starting to move the boat in to go get it unstuck for him, when another fish actually took that dangling fly and grabbed it hard enough that it hooked itself and unsnagged his fly for him. So that doesn't happen too often. So that was pretty special. And then, one of the things that I told you is I'm not really a trophy fisherman, but that's really in 2020, it was the year that I started fishing Paulina Lake again since I was in college. I honestly have learned a lot about it, and learned a lot about, myself, and really realizing that you shouldn't poo-poo stuff that you don't know everything about. And so I was kind of considered Paulina Lake as sort of the redheaded stepchild of East Lake. East Lake had so much more shallow water and bigger shoal areas and better fishing, and Paulina just didn't have that. It was mostly a deep water kokanee fishery. And one of my goals for 2020 was to learn, to learn more water, that stuff that I hadn't fished in a long time, or had never fished before in my life, but had always heard about. And so I added a few places to the list this summer, and Paulina Lake really stuck. I ended up doing a tremendous amount of guiding there after July, when I first started learning it again through a good friend of mine. And come fall, I just was entirely blown away by the size of the brown trout that we never saw in the main season until fall. And then suddenly they're up on these mud flats or cruising along these rocky shelves in very shallow water. And we're talking fish that are, most of them between 6 and 10 pounds, but certainly plenty of fish that are in the 15-pound range, and a few that are much bigger than that we would run into every once in a while. And, I had this customer that just recently moved to the area, and he brings his golden retriever in the boat, and he ended up hooking one of those fish on his first day with me, and didn't really get it, completely hooked. It came off pretty quickly, really had to get redemption. And so we went back about 10 days later, and Milt ended up catching, one of the nicer, not super trophy, but one of those nicer brown trouts. And it was very special, just a very, very cool experience to get that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me ask you something. All your years of guiding, what have you learned about people or human nature from guiding?
Well, I think I'm lucky enough to be guiding the majority of my people that I've had a long time relationship with, either through the fly shop or through the fly club, or, something already connected us. But, everybody's different. And for the most part, everybody is really pretty wonderful. We learn from each other. And I think one of the things, that has been great for me about, kind of my incomplete education, not having gone to a 4-year college and finished a degree, is being able to hang out with these people that are really brilliant in either their field or just in the way that they look at the world and other people and other cultures. And so for me, it's kind of been that, and also an opportunity to really, joke with people, and make them feel good, and to be their teacher. Or in fact, I think this is kind of funny. last year when I decided to reprint my business cards, which has always said Jeff Perin, owner, on my business card. Last year I decided that's boring. And is that really how I define myself now? So my new business card says Jeff Perin as the name, and then my title is Piscatorial Therapist. You can take
there
that. You can take that a lot of ways. I mean, there are days that we're out in the boat, and it's more than just me being a teacher about trout fishing. It can be being a teacher about life, or a teacher about lending an ear to a family situation, or political strife or something like that that's bothering people. And so I think I take that pretty seriously, that I'm not just a fishing guide, and I'm certainly far beyond just the owner of a fly shop now. I want to be special to people.
Oh man, what a great answer. Maybe you need to bolt a couch onto the back of your boat just in case they want to tell you more.
Yeah, well, one of my clients, this is hilarious. He's actually a psychiatrist, and his last name is Me Couch.
Man.
Me Couch.
Me Couch,
yeah. Mm-hmm. I love him. He does it with me 2 or 3 times a year, and has for a long, long time, and I love him. And I tease him that he hires me because he needs me.
Yeah, man, that's great. Well, it sounds like there's a two-way dialogue going on there. They're definitely learning from you, but you're also hungry to learn from them. So good for you.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So I always like to ask my guests at the end of the show, what great watering holes for the hungry, thirsty angler can you recommend in the area at the end of the day?
Yeah, I do like a good hamburger. I love a good steak, or, chicken or salmon or whatever. And Sisters has some great places. I think, one of our hangouts that we go to a lot is, there's a brewery here in town, local, owned by a local, run by locals. It's called Three Creeks Brewing. It's about a mile from the fly shop on the way towards Bend. It's still in city limits of Sisters. It's a beautiful brewery, great bar, great restaurant on one side for the family, bar on the other side for the 21 and up crowd, and good food, good service, congenial people. We love that place. There's a good Mexican restaurant in town that especially if the owner's cooking, they got great carnitas. We're always a big fan of that. A couple of fancy restaurants in town. If you come with your bride or your partner or your significant other,
sure,
that could be nice places to dine out after a day of enjoying the outdoors in Central Oregon.
Oh, very good. Well, we didn't have a chance to really run through your fly box and talk about your top flies, but Jeff, would you mind if we put some pictures of your fly box up on the Destination Angler Facebook and Instagram pages? Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, that'd be great. Maybe we can kind of list a few of them there so people can get an idea of what the top flies are. And we'll post some things to our show notes on that as well. Jeff, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I wish you extraordinary success and all you're doing out there. Sounds like you're doing a wonderful job with your clients. And thank you, everybody, for listening. As always, you can email me with comments and suggestions at shaig50@gmail.com. That's shaigh50@gmail.com. Music on the show is by Brothers Fountain, and please give us a share, like, or follow on Instagram and Facebook, and be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Hope you join the show, and we will see you again soon.
Well, I'll go from the land to the shining sea, but I know there's more to life than what the eye can see.